What's going on? Welcome back to the channel. Before we get into it, please consider subscribing, smashing that like button. It really helps out the channel. Now let's get into part 3 of the Alien vs. Predator cabinet build. And today we're going to focus on the control panel. What I'm going to start by doing is stripping the stock control panel. What we're going to basically do is transplant everything out of the Capcom home arcade stick into the stock configuration. So here's what we're going to do. We're going to unplug every single button. And we're going to leave the joysticks in place. We're just going to disconnect those from the encoder board, take off the encoder board, and then remove that as an entire assembly, leaving us with just the buttons and the joysticks. Now it's basically the same process with the Capcom home arcade. We're going to unscrew the bottom, well, that is once I take off these ball tops, preventing me from laying this thing flat, but we're going to keep all the buttons and joysticks in place. I want to keep this thing looking stock. Just don't want to really mess with that. Those buttons can't really be used anywhere else. So we're going to undo the 10 screws on the bottom that hold that base plate to the rest of the arcade stick. You know, as you're working with this arcade stick, you really appreciate the high quality. I mean, even this base plate is pretty rigid with all that reinforcement. And then once you do that, it's going to reveal basically that you've got a standard sort of JAMA setup. These Sanwa connectors need to be go ahead and disconnected from the joysticks themselves. So we're going to start there, just disconnecting those. And then I'm going to remove the screws that hold down the processor board and the other encoder board. Okay, we're at the point now where it's actually time to begin taking off all the wires, but before I do that, I want to go ahead and draw myself a little map here so that I can keep all these wires straight, because it's going to be easy to mess that up as we transfer this over to the other control panel. So I'm going to use some of these wire labels that you can pick up at Home Depot or Lowe's. These are used by electricians to keep wiring inside control panels straight. Now these are really stuck on the prongs on the buttons, so I had to use a pair of needle nose pliers, not on the wires themselves, just on the connector. Once you have that, you can remove that as an assembly and then put the whole thing back together. Now what I really love about the quality of this product is you can actually see all the pinouts actually tell you what everything is. So you've got player 1 down, up, right, and left. And then obviously, now the other ones, you're going to have to, they have just generic numbers you have to kind of figure out. But as far as your Sanwa directional controls, they're right there on the board. So that really made troubleshooting and eventually wiring this up just a breeze. And of course, now you'll notice with this Sanwa setup, they use 5 wires, but with the stock Arcade1up joystick, they have 8. So what we need to do is create a common ground. So we're going to cut these connectors off, and we're going to jump a wire from each switch to the other switch, creating that common ground, giving us that 5-wire setup. Once you have those 5 wires, keeping all that straight obviously, and referring back to the encoder, you're then going to be able to connect those wires up to the stock wiring harness off that Sanwa joystick, which means it's going to plug directly into that Capcom encoder. Alright, now it's time to make a mount for the processor board. I'm going to use the stock Arcade1up encoder as a pattern. I'm going to cut it out of some of this Lexan here. Just need something about the same thickness. It's going to be fairly rigid. I'm just going to make this cut with a standard jigsaw and then head over to the drill press to drill out the mounting holes. We're going to hit that with some black paint, let that dry. Now the next thing I want to do is reuse that stock power switch. Now when you're doing these kind of mods, you want to make sure that the stock components can handle the voltage you're going to put on it. And this is obviously going to handle the 12 volts that I'm going to use for this system. And it's also really important for yourself to make sure that you understand what on and off really means, what position that switch has to be in, especially if you're going to use multiple prongs, because this does have 6 prongs on it instead of just 2. So go ahead and just break out your multimeter and just do some simple continuity checks just to keep yourself straight. Now I'm not going to be reusing those stock wires. I wanted to be able to disconnect this on the power side if I ever wanted to remove the control panel. So I'm going to use one of my 5.5mm connectors here. I'm going to go ahead and thread those through the hole, kind of bend them over, and then obviously going to hit them up with some solder. Make sure that's a good strong connection. Finish them off with some heat shrink tubing, and then we've got a nice stock looking piece that's going to be able to be disconnected from the actual cabinet itself. Okay, now it's volume adjustment time, and unfortunately I'm not going to be able to reuse the stock switch on the control panel, so I'm going to go with one of these potentiometers. It's an inline volume adjustment potentiometer, and we're going to have to modify this bracket a little bit to kind of make this fit. You can see the marks that I made. We're going to have to trim just a little bit out of there to accommodate that board, so just use a simple file to kind of make that clearance possible. And you're going to go back and forth, make sure that thing fits nice. And of course, the way we mount this is through that little hole there on the piece that it came with. And we don't have a flat surface to drill through, so what I'm going to have to do is actually trim this piece to fit inside that bracket so that I can reuse that mounting hole. And to do that, obviously we're going to have to work this thing back and forth. I started with a flush trim saw to kind of take off a big flat straight chunk of that, and then I'm going to use a flapper wheel on my handheld grinder to kind of shape this thing. And because it's plastic and it's a pretty aggressive pad, it makes quick work of this. And so what you can do is kind of test fit it, go back and forth, and make sure this thing fits just exactly how you want it. Now once you're done with your rough shaping, go ahead and hit it with some fine grit sandpaper to really get this thing to fit like it should. And now we're going to bond these two pieces together with some JB Weld plastic bonder. Mix up the two parts, and don't be shy, don't be stingy about this. Try to prevent it from caking up too much on the top side, because you're going to have to take that off later. And now we've come back about an hour later, and you can see that I had to make a little bit of a clearance in the epoxy for the board itself, but I think I got to it just in time. It was still a little soft, but overall the bond is really, really strong. So now we go ahead and test fit this again, make sure that it works well, and it does. So now we just take the washer and the capture nut, snug that down, and now our two pieces are ready to go back into the control panel. Let's go install them. And here it is, all mocked up, everything in its stock location. The only thing that really isn't stock besides that potentiometer on the volume side is that extra coin button I had to add, but that is a stock Arcade1up button, and I had to modify the cover slightly to have clearance for the HDMI and our quick disconnect cables. And the last thing on the list is to go ahead and plug this into a monitor so you can do a quick I/O check just to verify that all the buttons and the directions on the joystick work correctly. And now we're going to try out a little bit of gameplay. So now here the control panel is back in the arcade cabinet, and you can see we have plenty of access to the volume control, to the power disconnect switch, and of course the HDMI and power for the board itself. The next thing to tackle is all the in-cabinet wiring. We're going to make sense of all of this jumbled mess. We're going to lay it out nice and neat, and then we're going to install the side art, but that's going to be in part 4. Stay tuned to the channel for that, and I'll see you next time.